Good evening, and welcome to tonight's forum on urbanization and social changes in developing nations. I'm Bob Enright, Chair of the Department of Sociology and Social Work. Tonight's forum is co-sponsored by the Department of Sociology and Social Work and the Center for the Small City. I'd like to briefly introduce each of our speakers in the order that they will be presenting. First, Dr. Ismaila Odogba, Assistant Professor of Geography, be followed by Dr. Krishna Roka, Visiting Assistant Professor of Sociology, Dr. David Chunyu, Assistant Professor of Sociology, and Dr. Brad Mates-Martins of the Department of Political Science, Assistant Professor. We're going to start off first with a few introductory comments from Professor Emeritus Bob Wolensky, who will serve as the moderator for tonight's forum. So please join me in welcoming all of our panelists.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming out on such a difficult evening. I know you really must love this topic to be here tonight. So it's good to see so many of our students, especially interested in urbanization and on a global scale, really. What's happening now around the world, especially in so-called developing nations, is precisely what happened in this nation beginning 150 years ago. In 1850, pick your date, around that time we were a very rural nation, but already beginning to urbanize. People moving from the rural to the urban areas, also people, many of your ancestors coming from over there to over here. And millions of them settled in our cities. The city of Chicago in 1830 had 30,000 people. In 1930 had over 3 million people in 100 years. Do the math. That's tremendous urbanization. Urbanization is the process of urban growth. Urbanism is living life in the city. And we're looking really mainly at large cities tonight, but given the Center for the Small Cities, a co-sponsor, we don't want to forget the small city, like Stevens Point, or the medium-sized city, like Madison, Springfield. Some may even want to call St. Paul, Minnesota, a medium-sized city, as opposed to the mega cities, like New York, which is 8 million, in a metropolitan area of darn near twice that. Our largest city and metropolitan area, New York City. So urbanization is what this is about, and the implications of urbanization. Big implications for so many different things that our panelists will talk about. The panelists will have 3 tasks. One, they'll present some data to you via PowerPoint on their respective area that they're going to look at, the respective international place they're going to look at. Secondly, they'll talk about the policies that different governments and different non-government agencies and different bodies like the UN are trying to develop to address this rapid urbanization around the world. And thirdly, some of the implications for the trends and the policies on our lives. And of course, you can join in after they've each had a chance to speak, and they're all going to speak for 10 minutes. I'm going to time them, and I'll give them a heave-ho. I have a big hook over here, and we'll yank them off after 10 minutes. And then at the end, that should leave plenty of time for us to ask questions. So think about a question that you might want to ask our panelists. So, without further ado, we will begin with Ish talking about urbanization and as relates to Africa. And after they speak, they're going to come over here and join me on this side.
So 10 minutes?
Sorry?
10 minutes?
10 minutes.
That's it? Okay.
As we rehearsed.
Okay, good evening. I'll be talking about urbanization in Africa, Professor Bob said, the world we live in today is actually one that is highly urbanized. We live in an urban world today. So globally, more people reside in urban area than rural areas. The fastest or the places that have the highest levels of urbanization are North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Europe. But what you notice is that despite the fact that Africa and Asia are considered fast urbanizing places, they are still largely rural as of 2014. You know, as of 2014, these two places were still largely rural. But it is projected, according by the United Nations, that by 2030, more than half of the world's population will be living in urban areas. Now, most of this growth that we see is going to occur in Asia and Africa. So by 2030, 7 out of every 10 people that reside in urban areas will be in either Asia or Africa. That's what this is. This data here portends. So what's the meaning of this? Well, as of 2014, according to the UN Habitat, Africa is still rural. 40% of the people in Africa still live in urban areas. Now, so what are urbanization trends? Because most of the growth we expect is going to occur in Africa and Asia. But what are the trends in Africa? Despite the fact that Africa is the least urbanized region in the world, it has the highest rate of urbanization compared to other regions. Now, what's driving this growth, this urban growth, is largely rural-urban migration as people move to seek opportunities or run away from conflict, push-pull factors, and also the natural rate of population increase. Now, this growth is going to occur in cities. Most of this growth will occur in the cities of Africa. Now, 70% of the growth that will occur in cities means that Africa now is having cities that are having populations of more than 1 million. Now you say, okay, what is 1 million? Why is 1 million significant? It's significant because as of 2010, Africa had 49 cities that had a population of 1 million plus. The US had only 42. That's an industrialized society. And India had 48. That's to give you the context. So it is projected that by 2030, Africa will have more than 73 cities that have populations of between 1 million to 5 million people. So that's the trend we are seeing. Now, as these places increase in population, what we see is urban primacy, where one city grows and dominates all the other cities, in the country. And what you can see here is that urban primacy is occurring largely on the west and the west and southern part of Africa. Now, when we talk of urban primacy, when you have urban primacy, because the US does not have any primate city, when we have urban primacy, what that implies is that there is unbalanced development in that country. Because the primate cities is where people keep going, so they function as not just political or centers of economic, but they're also centers of other activities. As these cities keep growing, what we begin to see is that they are beginning to merge, creating what we call mega regions. And as they create more mega regions, it becomes more difficult to do what? To address the issues of urbanization in Africa. For instance, if you look up there, you have Cairo and Alexandria, two largest cities in Morocco. They've actually merged. They're now a mega region. And then we also have regional variation trends, whereby even though these are the fastest 20 urbanizing cities in Africa, but what you need to understand is the urban proportion of people living in urbanized environment is actually higher in North Africa than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. So why does urbanization matter? Well, shanty towns. That's what happens. As Professor Bob said, we've had urbanization in North America. You know, as people moved to urban areas, there was growth associated with it. The problem with Africa is that industrialization-led urbanization is not occurring. So the people migrating, they lack jobs, they lack housing, they lack adequate sanitation, and that is leading to the creation of what? Shanty towns, or what you call informal settlements, or if you want to call them slums. So that instead of urbanization generating economic wealth, what it's creating in Africa is actually, when we talk of urbanization, we talk about the problems of the slums, crime, lack of sanitation facilities. As of 2010, 200 million Africans lived in what you call urban slums. They had no access, for instance, to toilet facilities, potable drinking water. And this is a common occurrence in Africa as a result of what? Urbanization. That is Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya. It's one of the largest slums in sub-Saharan Africa. To give you a context, Ethiopia, 99% of the urban people living in urban areas in Ethiopia are living in slums. 99%. So the question becomes, given all the problems associated with urbanization, what are the governments doing? There are three main policies: slum clearance, which is this is the famous floating slump in Africa, Nigeria. It's actually built on the Atlantic Ocean there, where people pile refuse and start informal settlements. We also have slum upgrading, which Morocco does by creating infrastructure. This is it used to be called, or it's still called, the rubbish city. That's refuse all over, people piling refuse on top of their houses. And then we have slum prevention, whereby you create the incentives for people not to migrate to urban areas. Those are the three main approaches that have been taken by governments in Africa, you know, usually working with the World Bank or with the United Nations. Now, what does the future look like? The main issue with Africa is the rapid pace of urbanization. It's just too fast for the urban areas to cope. So the future tends to look bleak. But if we had good strategies and policies that deal with urban planning, we can address most of these issues. When we talk of planned urbanization, we control the movement of people from rural to urban area by creating smaller cities and providing opportunities and infrastructures in such places. You focus on land tenure system, because most of these slums are built on land that either belong to governments or they belong to individuals. So they're not serviced with any kind of infrastructure. So you need to provide a reason for people to invest in the land. And then you need to provide economic opportunities for these places. Now, this looks like it's easier said than done. But the biggest challenge to achieving these integrated policies is what? Managing the urban complexities. Because as those cities grow and overlap with cities in other nations, one of the biggest problems with planning in Africa is the lack of what? Reliable data. So governments right now cannot talk about reliable data. Talk of when we have mega regions. That's going to be problematic. So despite the bleak future, I still think with urban planning, things can improve in Africa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ish. And some of those images you have seen on this particular presentation, we could have produced similar images for Chicago or any other American city in the slums, 100 years ago even, but even in the late 1800s, because that kind of migration creates serious housing problems and sanitation problems. And many of your ancestors came here in the 1850s and 60s and 70s before we even knew what germs were. Pittsburgh has the highest typhoid rate in the world around 1870 because they're drinking the water out of the Allegheny River. That is as polluted as could possibly be. They didn't know what was in the water. It smelled funny. So things are we have better prospects given our knowledge nowadays. So next, we're going to talk about Nepal. We're talking about India. We're going to talk about Southeast Asia with our next speaker.
Thank you, Bob. So I'll continue with what Ish was talking about urbanization in Africa. And when you look at my presentation, it may look very much similar to what Ish was talking. And this is a map just to give a hint as to where South Asia lies. And as you can see, it's filled with lots of dots. And those dots are what the urban areas or cities are going to look like. And by 2050, those dots are going to grow larger and larger, and it's going to it will be very hard to see the countries in the map. Just to give a context as to South Asia, this was the reason where I'm going to talk about, and the reason why we broke this whole Asia into South Asia, and then David Chunyu will be talking about China, is, as Ish said, most of the growth is happening in Africa and in Asia, and in Asia we have it's a huge continent, and there are lots of urbanization going, so we have to break it down. So that's South Asia, and these are the countries that consist of South Asia. But today I'm going to focus mainly on 4 countries. The reason is, as you can see here, India, China, and Bangladesh alone, right, where almost 1/4 of the global population lives there, right, in those 3 countries alone. And the reason I have Nepal is because I'm from Nepal, and the reason I don't have Sri Lanka is, I know, Nisha, that it is, Sri Lanka is one of the least urbanized country in the world, and so I thought that it does not fit within this context, but I'll come back to Sri Lanka later, why it is important that we need to learn from Sri Lanka. So along with its population growth, we also have this urbanization that's happening in these 4 countries. And as you can see, the projected data from 2013 to 2050, most of the urbanization is going to be almost similar in all those 4 countries. But when the rate is similar, as you can look, the population is going to be, when half of the India's 1.2 billion people live in urban areas, right? When 1/4 of the global population, the half of that live in urban areas, is going to be a huge implication for the world. Right? And another reason why urbanization in South Asia is important is, as you can see here, this is the map of 15 mega cities in the world. Mega cities are cities which have a population of more than 10 million. And as you can see, out of those 15, 5 of them are in South Asia. Right? And they are in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, and in India. And those 5 cities are Karachi, Dhaka, and as you can see, the population growth from 1970 in the last 50 years. Right? The population has gone from just in hundreds of growth rate, right? And then we have Karachi, and then we have Delhi, which is projected by 2025 or 2030 there will be around 35 million people. That is more than the population of Nepal, whose population is only 28 million right now. So Delhi alone is going to be like a big country, right? And along with that we have Mumbai, and then Kolkata, which is another large city. So 1/3 of all the mega cities that are going to be established by 2030 are going to be in this region. And not only in the mega cities, but also if you look at smaller cities like Kathmandu, which is capital of Nepal, with a population of over 1 million, it also is going to be urbanized at the same rapid rate. Right? And as you see the line, and it's projected that line is going to be get more steeper, and by 2050, its population might even double to 2 million. So what are those countries doing when we have this rapid urbanization growing, happening, and also cities growing, right? While many of the countries in the region do not have any concrete urban policies, India, which elected a new prime minister this summer, has come up with a plan which says cities of the future is he's come up with a plan for 100 smart cities which are more integrated with technology and energy efficiency and infrastructure, right? But there have been lots of questions that's been raised as to whether India, which is one of the most populous country in the world and also one of the poorest country in the world, and which has a history of failing in its plans, can achieve this. And this is a simulated or a design that the Prime Minister's office came up with in one of the state as a smart city, right? And other countries, they do not have such huge plans, but they do rely on World Bank or Asian Development Bank or other governmental assistance in planning, right, in managing the movement of people and also managing resources that may be needed to support population in those countries. So with that, the main focus of this forum or this workshop was to talk about, okay, we have these projections, right? We're going to have these mega cities. We're going to see this rapid urbanization in these countries. Now what that means to the future. The first thing we need to we need to talk about is economy, right? What happens? And the major challenge is, as we saw in Africa, we might see the similar pattern of urbanization that's happening. So we have these high-rise skyscrapers, and just in front of them, or juxtaposed to them, we have these slums, sandy towns, right? So with economy, if we do not address it right now, we have this huge inequality that's been developing in those countries or in those cities. And as they grow, right, that inequality is going to widen, and that's a huge concern for the future. Along with economy, we have a concern with the environment. While we know with large cities, there are always issues with pollution, air pollution, and other energy uses, but the major challenge for, especially in South Asia, is managing waste. Right? As we have this 30, 40, or even 10 million people coming in small areas and which lack infrastructure, and this is what happens. We do not have any facilities or any policies to managing waste, and that's going to be a major challenge for many of these cities, especially in countries like in Nepal or Bangladesh, which are one of